When Chabrier's L'Étoile was premiered in 1877 at the Bouffe Parisien, the audience knew what to expect. Or did they? The theatrical landscape of Paris in the 19th century was a somewhat unique one among European cities. It had many public theaters, which each had particular restrictions as to what kind of repertoire could be produced there, as well as other practical concerns such as number of characters, use of music, number of acts, and so on. The most prestigious theater was the state-subsidized opera, which by this time had a canon of grand operas, elaborate, sung-through spectacles, usually with serious historical plots. Then there was the opéra comique, which, contrary to what you might be thinking, was not supposed to be comic, as in funny. Many of the classic French operas were premiered at the opéra comique, including Bizet's Carmen and Massenet's Cendrillon. There was also a theater specifically for Italian opera, theaters for vaudeville, and so on. Jacques Offenbach's Théâtre des Bouffes Parisiens opened its doors in 1855, filling a gap in this already colorful theatrical tapestry. He saw the need for full-length musical works that were unashamedly funny, and thus was born the genre of opéra bouffe, or what we often now call French operetta. These works were typically 3 acts, with spoken dialogue interspersed with light, catchy musical numbers, ranging from solo songs to ensembles with full chorus. They typically began with a potpourri-style overture, a medley of tunes from the drama to follow. Audiences going to the Bouffe Parisien would have expected all of these things, even if they knew nothing of L'Étoile specifically. And their expectations would have been met. They also would have expected a fantastical and ridiculous plot and would not have been disappointed. The piece opens on King Ouphe, who is searching the kingdom for someone complaining about the government so that he has an excuse to execute them by impalement, a birthday tradition of his. Meanwhile, a group of diplomats from a neighboring kingdom arrive, disguised as shopkeepers. The group includes Princess Laoula, who, unbeknownst to her, is intended to marry King Ouphe. They encounter an actual shopkeeper, Lazuli, who instantly falls in love with Laoula. When he loses her, he begins to complain, and the king seizes him to be impaled. At the last moment, the king's royal astrologer, Sirocco, appears and declares that the king's lucky star and Lazuli's lucky star are so linked that they will die within 1 day of each other. The king spares Lazuli, but keeps him in the castle for safety. Eventually, he manages to run off with Laoula, only to be mistakenly shot and presumed dead. The king prepares for his death, but exactly 24 hours later, Lazuli reappears and all is well again. So far, we've seen how L'Étoile fits into the conventions of its genre. But what makes it exceptional? The first thing that stands out is its colorful and complex orchestral writing. Chabrier certainly used his fair share of the standard oom-pa accompaniment of light opera, but he also incorporated many moments of adventurous harmonies, as well as constantly shifting textures. This is evident from the very beginning of Act 1, right after the overture. Let's listen to how the fast unison runs in the strings and low woodwinds, alternating with snippets of melody in the upper winds, and then rapidly modulating tremolos, create a mysterious and intriguing atmosphere to draw us in. The musicians at the premiere were a little baffled by the difficulty of Chabrier's writing, and they needed more rehearsals than usual. They even complained that they, quote, weren't at the Bouffe to perform Wagner, end quote. One of the librettists later wrote that the orchestra still wasn't fully ready by the time of the premiere, which possibly contributed to the piece's initial lukewarm reception. Of course, that won't be a problem at IU. Another notable aspect of this opera is the particular and vibrant fantasy world that is created through musical and other means. The bizarre customs in Ouf's kingdom, such as the birthday impalement, would be unbelievable in our world, so Chabrier and the librettist Van Loo and Leterrier built a fantasy world using markers of otherness or alienness. Scholars refer to this approach as one of abstract exoticism. Many exotic operas from the time tended to use the approach of local color, or using musical and visual cues to try to depict a very specific location. A piece set in Spain, like Carmen, would sound very different from one set in India. However, the creators of L'Étoile were not trying to depict a specific place on Earth, so they used more general markers of exoticism sprinkled in with the more unmarked styles of the piece. Drones, pentatonic or modal melodies, and percussion can be heard frequently throughout, most often accompanying Princess Laoula, the foreign dignitary. For example, in her introductory moment, where she rehearses her role as a shopkeeper, she sings a modal melody doubled by the oboe against a darkly orchestrated ostinato in the background. This is a similar exotic trope to that used in the Arabian dance from Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker. Let's listen.
Voyageons pour nos affaires à travers villes et cités. Nous sommes premiers de magasins de nouveautés.
Often, these moments of abstract exoticism morph seamlessly into the more general, light operatic style. For example, in the chorus in Act 2 announcing the wedding of King Ouf, a dramatic moment of drones in open fifths lead to an almost Sousa-like cadential figure. Another way this alien fantasy world is evoked is through the names of the characters. Some are unusual combinations of letters, like Laoula. Some are foods, like tapioca, animals, like porc-épic, which is French for porcupine, other natural images like lazuli, or simply names that have a kind of lost in translation kind of hilarity, like oaf, which brings to mind the French word for egg, but also the word oaf, and even the expression oof. The juxtaposition of names and musical cues that don't logically go together give this piece an absurdist kind of humor. In fact, it almost anticipates the absurdist and surrealist movements of the 20th century. A recent promotional announcement sent out by IU suggested that Dali, the painter of the melting clocks, would fit right into this world, and I completely agree. L'Étoile also juxtaposes very different emotional registers, from the beautiful and idealistic to the banal and physical. For example, in Act 1, Lazuli bursts into the famous number Ô petite étoile, calling out to his lucky star to tell him the future, expressing faith that his star has the power to fulfill his dreams and even make him a king. He then falls asleep and is happened upon by Laoula and Aloe, who decide the thing to do is to tickle him awake. The opera has other moments of real tenderness and emotion, such as in the third act when Laoula sings of her sadness at Lazuli's supposed death, and later when Aloe tries to comfort her by telling her about falling out of love with her husband. But in case we were ever at risk of feeling too sentimental, the piece gives us other numbers imitating base bodily functions, including sneezing, kissing, drunkenness, and of course, the ode to impalement. It goes without saying that much of the charm and appeal of L'Étoile lies in its humor, which needs no commentary. After all, explaining the joke takes the fun out of it. So I will leave that to be experienced, but I will spend a moment talking about the themes of astrology and fate that I think this opera develops well, using the conventions of the genre. Much of the plot hinges on prophecies that the astrologer Sirocco gives the king, effectively tying together the fates of Lazuli, Oph, and Sirocco himself based on the titular lucky star. The three characters have three different attitudes toward the star and their fate. Oph tries to escape it by using his political power. Sirocco, as the voice of the star, tries to manipulate it. Lazuli is the true believer, who has no astrological or astronomical expertise, but trusts implicitly that this higher power has his best interests at mind. Indeed, the music seems to suggest that Lazuli's is the correct attitude. His song in Act 1, Ô Petite Étoile, is the most extensive moment celebrating the star itself. Let's listen to this melody. But this is not the first time we have heard this melody. It was previewed in the Potpourri Overture. The melody itself is a prophecy to us, the listeners. And when it returns in brief moments where things seem to be turning Lazuli's way, we know that prophecy is being fulfilled. Despite the absurd and somewhat unpredictable plot, we know that the fate of the piece is truly written in the stars. In the late 19th century France, there is a popular fascination with science, and especially with astronomy. This was the time of Jules Verne, who wrote Voyage to the Moon and Around the Moon, among other science fiction classics. I think it is significant that the librettist of L'Étoile, Van Loo and Leterrier also collaborated 2 years earlier on Offenbach's Voyage to the Moon, an operetta about a fantastical kingdom on the moon, which was in part inspired by some of Verne's stories. Together, these works paved the way for other fictions imagining other worlds in connection with outer space. I think it is no coincidence that the genre of the ever-popular film series Star Wars is commonly called space opera. Thank you.